Good afternoon. I'm Cindy Nguyen from the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy at Boston College Law School. On behalf of the Rappaport Center, it is my pleasure to welcome you to what we hope will be a deeply engaging and timely program entitled Moving Towards Equitable Clean Energy in Cities, co-sponsored by the Schiller Institute for Integrated Science and Society at BC and the Environmental Law Society at BC Law School. The term energy or clean energy kind of sound a little technical, and you might wonder what is the connection between energy to environmental justice and environmental racism. Historically, marginalized groups and low-income communities have been adversely affected by the energy sector. In the combustion of fossil fuels, for instance, for years, low-income communities and communities of colors, specifically Black communities, have been negatively impacted by gas and diesel-powered vehicles. Interstate highways were deliberately built as barriers to prevent Black population from integrating into white communities. And emission from traffic has been one of the most significant contributors to unhealthy air quality, leading to disproportionate cases of asthma, cancer, and other respiratory illnesses in these communities. Furthermore, residents of low-income communities often occupy older homes that are often energy inefficient, resulting in high energy use intensity, a proxy for energy waste and higher bills. The inability to afford energy can be a matter of life or death. Both urban and rural low-income residents have spent up to at least 3 times as much as of their income on energy costs compared to higher income residents. An estimated 25 million households have to choose between paying their energy bills or foregoing food or medicine. Today, in our fight against climate change, we know that energy plays a central role in reducing carbon emissions. We are seeing innovative technologies and policy on the federal, state, and local level intended to create emission reduction, tax credit for electric vehicles and solar, utility energy efficiency programs, building performance standards policy, and so forth. However, some of these efforts and investments are not being equitably distributed. While climate change has forced us to rethink the way we generate and distribute energy, energy justice is vitally necessary as it discloses the need to ensure that energy policy are examined through the lens of social and racial justice. We are seeing massive investment in infrastructure and energy transformation. And so our conversation today begs the question of how can we ensure that as we transition to clean energy in cities, the benefits will directly reach marginalized communities. Additionally, how are we ensuring that communities have a say in shaping their energy futures through policy involvement? We are so fortunate today to have an all-star panel to share their work in this area. Dr. Diana Hernandez, the mother of energy insecurity, and currently the visiting professor at the Resto Stage Foundation. Dr. Tony REAMES, who we also can call the father of energy justice and senior advisor for the US Department of Energy Office of Economic Impact and Diversity. And Brad Swing, who single-handedly created the energy program in Boston and is the director of energy policy and the programs at the City of Boston's Mayor's Office. The conversation will be moderated by the Rappaport Center Senior Fellow in Residence, Jeremy Orr, Director of Litigation and Partnership Advocacy at Earthjustice. Jeremy has been with us for the last 3 days, engaging with students, faculty, staff, and community members at Boston College. Born and raised in Detroit, Jeremy has shared his deep passion and commitment to environmental justice, energizing us all in this necessary fight for equity. At Earthjustice, a premier nonprofit public interest environmental law organization with over 500 lawyers and legal experts, Jeremy is training lawyers to read the power of law and the strength of partnership to protect people's health, to advance clean energy, and to combat climate change. Prior to joining Earthjustice, Jeremy served as a senior attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council, where he focused on drinking water and source water protection issues, working to ensure that all people have access to safe, sufficient, and affordable drinking water. His full bio will be shared in the chat below. Please note that the program is being recorded, and there will be time at the end of the program for Q&As. The Rappaport Center's next 2 program will be in April, a conversation with the Massachusetts Attorney General candidates on April 12th, both in person and virtual, and the Restorative Justice Conference on April 21st. And with that, I would like to turn to Jeremy to introduce the other panelists and to lead the discussion. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Cindy. It's been an honor to be here all week at Boston College Law School with the Rappaport Center, interacting with students on a number of environmental justice issues. And particularly, I'm really excited about this event today. I'm very acutely aware and feel that climate change and energy are kind of the issue of our generation. And although I predominantly have worked on water and other infrastructure issues over the years, I think this is an issue that I continue to be passionate about, and I'm really excited to be moderating this panel of experts who are leading the way and helping us navigate and solve really the climate crisis, and get us to a place of equitable renewable energy usage. So thank you for my introduction. Thank you for the introduction of our great panelists. So what I'd like to do is start off with each panelist, maybe giving 3 to 5 minutes, to share a bit about their work before we dive into some more targeted substantive questions. So again, we have Dr. Diana Hernandez, Dr. Tony Reames, and Director Bradford Swing. So I'd like to start with Dr. Hernandez. Just take a few minutes to share more about your work and your research.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, and also to Cindy and the other organizers. To me, this is a bit of a full circle. I have to say that I learned about energy insecurity in Boston. I was doing my dissertation research in Dorchester, and I see Bill Walczak on the attendee list. And I have to say that I was also living in Savin Hill and working with the basically working with the Boston Medical Center and their family advocacy program. That's what it was called then. Now it's called the Medical Legal Partnership. And there were a bunch of lawyers that were trying to resolve issues that were affecting health. And housing and Dorchester actually kind of were part and parcel and so kind of present in the program. And I decided to kind of fashion a whole study around looking at kind of how lawyers help to mitigate the relationship between poor housing and poor health. And I lived in Dorchester, and I was recruiting participants from community health centers all around Dorchester. And I mention this because to me, part of the understanding of energy insecurity is really about understanding its social location, its physical location, and the social location of folks that are impacted by this phenomenon. So I was visiting people's homes. This was a home-based study. And I essentially kind of was expecting to see a lot of what was already available in terms of our understanding about the relationship between poor housing and poor health, which had to do with mold and crowding being doubled and tripled up and some of these other kind of housing conditions. But what I was actually kind of encountering in addition to those things was something that hadn't been characterized in the academic literature. It was people that were living in cold homes. It was people that had like, a whole kind of electrical setup, no lighting in the bathroom. So they had extension cords all the way through the living room. They were living in darkness because they were so afraid of turning on the lights because of the costs. And to me, there was something about those experiences that weren't captured, but were important. And there are so many kind of aspects of that project that still resonate and are important to my understanding. But I remember this one woman saying, I feel like I'm heating the whole of Boston because basically, her bill was extremely high, but it was also completely inefficient and extremely kind of burdensome for her and her family. I've since have relocated to New York City And I have done a lot of work around the United States, kind of looking at this kind of phenomenon of energy insecurity, which is defined as the kind of inability to adequately meet household energy needs. And it really is about where people are. So, their kind of financial standing. It's about the kind of historic nature of racial residential segregation and kind of racist housing practices and policies. It's also about the physical condition of housing and these kind of lack of investment in housing infrastructure. And it's also about not incorporating people into the future of housing, but I think right now into the future of energy and the future of kind of climate policy. And so my work continues, but I will always be very, very, very grateful for having learned about this hidden hardship in Boston and in Dorchester in particular. And I'll kind of leave my comments there, but happy to pick up on so much of this in the Q&A and kind of later discussions with the panel.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Bradford. Thank you, Dr. Hernandez. One thing that really, stands out to me in your comments were the idea of this energy burden and the lengths that people have to go to access energy in their homes. And I've talked a bit about this week, a bit in my own work around water insecurity. And I grew up in a home that oftentimes got shut off from water because we couldn't afford it. And the lengths, me and my community would go to access water, right? So in my home, we had jars of water in the basement. So whenever our water got cut off, we would go heat it up on the stove. Other folks in our community would hook up the water hoses to other people's homes to make sure that they had access to water. And this idea that, this energy burden, utility burden, oftentimes feels like a myth, but it's people's lived realities on a very massive scale. So thank you for sharing that. Next, we're going to go to Director Swing to share a bit about your work as well.
Thank you. It's a real honor to be with this panel and with the Rappaport Institute. My work for Boston began with managing the development of a pilot green building, which is located at the Boston Nature Center in Mattapan. And it was an opportunity for us to understand the opportunity for better integrated design to build buildings that were healthier for people to breathe in. Upfront integrated design was brand new at that time. This was 1999. The building was dedicated in 2002. And I'll never forget when Mayor Menino was out there and we had school kids from around the corner. And one of the school kids tugged on the mayor's suit and said, Mayor, I have asthma and I just breathe better in this building. And that was because up front, we were able not only to make it more energy efficient with the shell of the building and traditional energy efficiency design issues, but it was the first geothermal building in Boston. So no, carbon fuel burning on site. And we selected low VOC paints and minimal off-gassing carpets. And the result was you took a deep breath and you just breathed better. We called it the building that teaches. And we used the process to develop green building zoning, and that took until 2007. I would say my next major intervention was to get residents of Boston more involved in energy efficiency programs that are administered at the state. We have a statutory requirement for our utilities to take funds that ratepayers contribute to energy efficiency programs and then administer those programs. What I discovered with some research was that the city of Boston was paying in far more than we were getting back, because these programs were designed to help single family homes be energy efficient, homes with attics and basements. And frankly, I learned quickly, homes that were owned and then occupied by often, frankly, wealthy professionals who were dedicated to the hard work of being home 4 or 5 times to have the assessment and the work done to do an energy efficiency retrofit. And so I created Renew Boston, which was a comprehensive use of federal ARRA funds under the Obama Recovery Act. And we did a great deal of work to raise attention to the urban issues of residential energy efficiency, building type, occupants, renters. And we're still working hard to do that. We were able to get the legislature to create a seat for cities and towns on the council that oversees the multi-billion-dollar 3-year utility energy efficiency plans. It's big bucks. And I occupied that seat for 6 years. So, you know, municipal government doesn't really have much say over energy. It's really, as Mayor Menino reacted to me when I suggested we have an energy program back in 2004, when I first sat with him. He said, why would I do that? It's a fight among state agencies. I work for city government. I work for Mayor Michelle Wu. I work for Chief Reverend Mariama White Hammond. I work for people who are environmental justice warriors who are trying to connect the frontline basic city services that are at the core of what municipal government is about with making sure that Boston residents have more say over their energy future. And so I've been involved in studying the map of Boston as it relates to how we can promote more energy efficiency, more renewable energy, solar, more so-called distributed resources like demand response and batteries. These are these key technologies that really allow us to have a much more rational level grid, which in the discussion, I will discuss why that is so important to the residents of Boston. Increasingly, the issue of electrification of the city as a primary climate strategy is in front of everybody. And our residents, in a broad-based way, are really understanding that that means that there's going to be a lot of construction of new electricity infrastructure. And I'm very dedicated to finding a way to make sure that that is done in an environmentally just way. It was not fair that renters in Boston weren't getting the benefits of paying their electric bill and thus the efficiency programs. And now these same residents are demanding that they be much more frontally engaged in their own energy future. So that's what my work is primarily involved with now.
Thank you for the intro, Director Swing, and in particular the piece of, you know, this idea that you've always fully understood that you work for community, right? You work for a constituency and making sure that their voices are prioritized in the midst of decision making is so important, right? I think that's what, you know, this conversation today and this panel is about, but it's also what the work of energy justice and equity is about. It's centering those communities and making sure that their needs are met. So thank you. And then next we'll go to Dr. Tony Reames.
All right, thank you so much, Jeremy. First want to thank Cindy and the Rappaport Center and all the event planners for the invitation today. And also apologize in advance because I must depart early from what I know is going to be a really amazing conversation. So please accept my apologies there. And it's always a pleasure to share space with my good friends, Jeremy and Diana, and it's great to meet you, Brad. So at the height of the economic recession, I came across a report from the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation entitled African Americans and Climate Change, an Unequal Burden. It was published in 2004. And the executive summary starts with this sentence: where US energy policy is concerned, African Americans are the proverbial canaries in the mine shaft. Let me repeat that. Where US energy policy is concerned, African Americans are the proverbial canaries in the mine shaft. These words struck a chord with me, and the data within the report furthered my concerns. This report and its findings became the foundation of what's become my work over the last decade. How do we better understand the production and persistence of racial and ethnic energy disparities? And what are the pathways for solutions to eradicate those disparities? A lot of my work has focused on residential energy access and affordability, whether it's geographically visualizing the correlation between residential racial segregation in Kansas City or Detroit and lower levels of energy efficiency, as Diana was talking about, finding that the cost to switch from an inefficient incandescent bulb to an efficient LED bulb was twice as expensive in poor neighborhoods as it was in wealthier neighborhoods, or identifying that 1 in 8 Michigan households had no access to financial resources to help them make their homes more energy efficient. But we can have hope. all of these disparities have solutions. And that brings me to my current role at the US Department of Energy, where it's an honor to serve President Biden, Secretary of Energy Granholm, and the American people in the Department of Energy's Office of Economic Impact and Diversity. I've been in this role for about 9 months now, and I'm responsible for helping lead the implementation of the President's ambitious Justice 40 initiative, which establishes a all of government framework to ensure that at least 40% of the benefits of climate and energy investments flow to communities that have for too long borne the burden of an unfair and unjust energy system. Our office also has an extraordinary statutory mandate that I hope I get a chance to talk about. From its establishment in 1978 as the Office of Minority Economic Impact, we advise the Secretary on the effects of energy policies, regulations, and other actions respecting minority participation in the Department of Energy, thinking about regulations and how they impact communities of color. We also manage a technical assistance program for minority educational institutions to build a diverse energy workforce. And then we also have a mandate to provide loans to minority business enterprises. So every day we come here with the grand challenge of how we totally transform our energy system, because I'm sure everybody on this call knows that we are currently in the energy transformation period. And this is the moment that we've been waiting for. Everybody on this call, are the ones who can and will and have been working hand in hand with communities to make the change that they so desperately need and have been working on for so long through good and dark times. And with that, I'll end because I look forward to the chat, and I'll pass it back to you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Dr. Reames. So one thing I want to do, I want to start with a few questions to each of you, open it up to each of you, but in particular, before we open it up to the audience for questions. But one thing I want to ask, right, especially thinking about kind of local and state level opportunities and challenges, and particularly at the local level, what are some opportunities, some successes and opportunities that you all are seeing at the ground level in certain communities that could also particularly be duplicated elsewhere? I'll start with Dr. Reames, if you want to go first.
Yeah, so my work is very local based. I did a PhD in public administration in a local government program. So really interested in how federal and state policy is actually implemented, and does it still meet the intent of of the federal and state policy that's been passed, but also how does it respond to the conditions on the ground. And so a lot of my work has been in Kansas City because I was living there at the time when I was doing my PhD, and in Detroit once I came to the University of Michigan. Detroit, is like an epicenter of energy justice action. And I guess one example I'll give from Detroit was the Public Service Commission rarely had meetings in the city of Detroit. They were often in the suburbs. Detroit doesn't have the best public transit system. Meetings were during the middle of the day when people were at work. But a coalition of community groups, Big Greens, local groups, got together on a utilities integrated resource planning process and demanded that the Public Service Commission host a meeting in Detroit in the evening. Some people showed up. They went through a process of, kind of educating people on what an IRP is, how you make public comment. And the meeting ran over the expected time because so many people showed up to make public comment, express their concerns about the energy mix that the utility was proposing. People that weren't comfortable speaking in public, stood outside with signs, got other people signed up to make public comment online. And I think it's that type of kind of grassroots engagement that leads us to a path for energy democracy.
Thank you. Director Sweeney?
We are currently purchasing electricity for the residents of Boston through a program that's known locally as Community Choice Electricity. It's municipal aggregation. It's an opportunity that was opened up by the Massachusetts State Legislature when they restructured the electric utility industry in 1997. It has taken until the past few years for there to be the community activist push to really make this electricity purchase program a reality, certainly for Boston. We only launched it a year ago. One prime reason we do it is that it allows us to use our buying power to increase the amount of renewable energy that is in the basic electricity service that residents receive. It's an opt-out program, so you're automatically in it unless you send in a postcard, and which you can do anytime, no cost. But you can go back in and out of the program, never any penalties, but it is an opt-out program. But what I want to highlight is that one of the real reasons we are doing this, and something that Mayor Michelle Wu is especially concerned about, is that ever since the electricity supply market was deregulated, there have been companies that go door to door and sell individual electricity supply contracts to people. And frankly, I'm going to say out loud, with the support of the Massachusetts Attorney General, that this work is predatory and we want them out. So does the Massachusetts Attorney General. We have a lot of legal issues about pushing a company, an industry out of the Commonwealth and out of the city. But what we say to our residents is that you can trust the city to make better electricity purchases. Our pricing is transparent. You can go in and out whenever you want. Right now, you can get 100% green electricity for cheaper than the basic service provided by the electric utility. I'm required, regulated to say this: we cannot promise that our electricity rates will always be lower than the basic service rates of the utility. There we go, DPU, if you're listening, I've done it. But what I want to say, and what I've learned, especially from my cabinet chief, Reverend Mariama White-Hammond, who is a significant environmental justice warrior in the Commonwealth, the predatory, we have mapped where this predatory electricity supply individual contracts are, and I'm talking rates that are 3 times what you have to pay, teaser rates that jump up. It maps precisely with the redlining maps of the 1950s. And so our office is undergoing a top to bottom appreciation that environmental justice, racial justice, energy justice, and equity are the front line of what we do, and our municipal aggregation program and our opportunity to help these residents get on a better electricity rate could not be more important to the direct capacity of our residents to balance that food, fuel, medicine issue that we know they're balancing every day. So that's just one way that we do our work.
Thank you. And Dr. Hernandez?
Following those really kind of comprehensive examples, I'll give a little bit more of a flavor of the kinds of initiatives that I've seen. And I'll start with the Department of Energy and Environment in Washington, D.C. So they have a really interesting approach to addressing the question of energy burden. And that's basically by providing access to not just energy assistance through LIHEAP, but also a discount program that reduces the kind of fees attached to utility bills. Also access to weatherization and a subscription to community solar, as well as water discounts on a monthly basis. I mean, one of the kind of biggest challenges around energy assistance, as it were, is that this is a one-time and or emergency kind of crisis level assistance, but the bills come on a monthly basis. And so there are really kind of interesting examples on the waterfront. I think, probably thanks to you, Jeremy, and others like you that are kind of really elevating the issue of water justice and water insecurity. There are new programs that are being designed. Kind of the antiquated programs around energy don't do that. And I think that that's a big problem, but the DOEE is doing this. But I will say there are other examples. Percent income payment plans in Ohio. I think increasingly there's a push also in Rhode Island to integrate percent income payment plan so that there's actually kind of affordability. There's the energy democracy work. Tony kind of illustrated this really amazing example of people participating in the process. For rural electric co-ops, that really happens at the board level. And so I have personally witnessed work in Greene County, Alabama, where folks are, again, kind of getting busloads of residents and member owners to show up, to go to the kind of annual meeting, to vote, to get folks on the board that look like the constituency. That is really hopeful. And the other example that I'll give is recent work, or I guess relatively recent, around the Disconnection Reform Act in California. And that work was really spearheaded by the Utility Reform Network. And that was a multi-year, kind of multi-component, really comprehensive approach to getting people on the, kind of involved in the regulatory process, telling their stories, being kind of the advocates, self-advocates and advocates for others. And really kind of pushing back on the process and saying, like, disconnections aren't really your answer to the non-payment issue. We need to be thinking about this differently. So those are kind of different examples from around the country that kind of give me hope, but I think are also good illustrations of that mix between what needs to happen from kind of government and people coming together around these issues.
Thank you. Thank you. And those are all three great answers. And one thing that stands out to me about it is really centering, right, those examples on communities in need. And one question, I have is, as we see kind of more resources and investment, particularly, in energy and moving in the direction of energy justice, and thinking of things like the Justice 40 initiative, ensuring that it's supposed to go to the communities that it's supposed to go to. How do you all define community, right, as a whole, like in your work, particularly defining it in a way that makes sure those resources that are becoming available are going to the actual communities that they are meant to go to, especially when we're talking about overburdened communities? I don't know if anyone wants to start that one off.
I mean, I'm just going to start by saying that, I mean, obviously, I respected and admire Tony and Dr. REAMES for all of the work that he's done, especially in spatially defining communities, right? Actually using mapping tools and spatial analysis to be able to identify and target very specifically communities that are burdened. So, I mean, I look to him, and obviously he could say a lot more about his methods, but that I think was really kind of the beginning of being able to, have a systematic approach to identifying communities, at the very least in this more kind of quantitative way. And then kind of coupling that with case studies. So I don't know, I'll kind of kick it off to you, Tony.
Oh, thank you for that, Diana. And we've had this conversation multiple times, and I see our other colleague, Carlos Martin, is on. How do you define community, right? There is, the connections between individuals, and then there's kind of the spatial boundaries that, we use in statistics and data visualization. So I'll talk briefly about how we do it through the Justice 40 initiative, which is a data-driven approach using census data, which is not perfect, but you can find disparities, you can define areas and target areas. And so the Council on Environmental Quality recently released their Climate Economic Justice Screening Tool, CJEST, and that's open for public comment. I'll post that in the chat, but it is identifying census tracts that meet certain characteristics of vulnerability, pollution, income, to allow us to think about communities that would receive the biggest benefits and have borne the biggest burden of the energy system. And so how do we direct clean energy and climate investments sustainable housing investments to those communities. A lot of this will depend on states and local governments as well. Federal dollars flow out of DC to states who then distribute it across their states. And so we need partners like Brad to really say, like, where does this need to go within your community? Because there is some additional information that states and localities have that we don't have in kind of the national data set tools that we use to identify places. We can look at the new example of New York. They've just released their disadvantaged community mapping tool. California has a tool. Illinois has their environmental justice tool. Michigan will be coming out with an environmental justice tool soon. So there are several examples across the country. We have states that we probably need to bring along who haven't done this type of analysis. And so having a national tool allows states that haven't kind of gone through that effort themselves to be able to help them identify communities. And so, one other thing I'll point out is that because this definition is so complex, if you look at the Justice 40 initiative and the guidance from the White House, there are two definitions of community. So there's the spatial, kind of geographically located definition, and then there's also a definition of individuals or groups who have some shared experience. And so I think that's another good definition of community. So like one definition we're using that definition for is HBCUs, tribal colleges, and MSIs. They may be spread across the country, but they share an experience of being underrepresented and participating in DOE energy programs.
Thank you. And Director Swing?
I work for a new mayor who is putting together her team and has very ambitious plans to reorganize some particularly fixed structures of Boston city government. Locals on the call will know that Mayor Wu is dedicated to reorganizing planning and economic development in Boston very seriously, very structurally. She's filed for the unwinding of 6 urban renewal districts, the 19 that are legally governing a lot of very old approaches to developing the city. I mention that to say that it's premature for me to define exactly how we at the local level will be like structuring the Justice 40 guidelines, but it is top to bottom, part of her start of this ambitious new administration. Community for me, I think about how much difficulty I had when I was starting to create programs to connect Boston residents to these state-governed efficiency programs that they pay into. And I tried to get customer-level energy use data from the utilities. I was like, look, community, one level of community is Boston. We are the city of Boston. We represent all the residents of Boston. And for heaven's sakes, why can't the mayor's office, on behalf of our residents, give shape and direction to our own energy future? And to do so, we would like to know whose energy use intensity needs some specific targeting. We would like to do outreach. We would like to help. We would like to hold hands. Energy efficiency retrofit work is complicated. It touches the home 5 times. I'm going to say very quickly, one thing I am just so dedicated to. I don't think that worldwide climate activists have any appreciation of what is involved when you touch an individual's residence. People snap a finger and say, we're going to have resilience upgrades of every residence on the waterfront of the world. Well, let me tell you something. When you were doing a retrofit of a middle unit of a famous Boston triple decker, and it's rented, and the occupant is an hourly worker whose first language is not English, that needs so much specific attention. If we want that resident to be home when the energy efficiency work is done, we need to figure out how to pay the wages she's lost. I don't hear anyone ever talk about that. I went through this with trying to get residential energy efficiency in the ground for Boston. I could not get customer level energy use data from the utilities, and I still can't. When we created our aggregation program, we asked our local PUC, Public Utility Commission, the Department of Public Utilities, please give us the addresses of every electric utility customer in Boston, because we would like to do outreach to those customers that I described in my introduction are being targeted in a predatory, focused, geographically, oh, these people annoy me in case you can't tell. And we wanted their addresses. We wanted to do outreach. We have a management that can reach out to them, community relations manager, and they wouldn't provide it to us. So we are litigating that. Why should we have to litigate with state government to get this from the electric utilities? So before I get too exercised, I'll take a deep breath and stop.
No, I think that's spot on. In particular, that piece on transparency. When I think about the work that I've done over the years around utilities, in particular water utilities, the biggest barrier to my legal and policy advocacy is lack of information and data from the utility, who I know has it, right? But just there's no requirement for them to disclose that information, right? And then when we FOIA it, right, half of the information, if not more than half of what I need, is redacted. So those FOIAs aren't useful. So part of that reform requiring transparency in this work, I think, is so important across utilities.
Jeremy, could I make one quick point? This is a legal Rappaport Center for Law, and there's an incredibly important distinction that I learned day one of being the energy policy director for Boston. There is a fundamental legal distinction between taxpayer-funded government and ratepayer-funded investment-owned utilities. Our utilities are regulated monopolies, and the CEO of our local electric utility made over $20 million last year. But the reason I can't get customer level energy use data is because they claim it's not public information. Taxpayer government work is public, ratepayer funded utility work is not.
Thank you for that distinction. Now I have one more question for each of you before I open it up. So we talked about defining community, and we also talked about this idea of resources, beginning to come into communities to do the work of energy justice and do these upgrades. But how do we ensure that the work of energy, the intersection of energy is also accounting for issues such as housing or transportation, and acknowledging that overlap there? I'll start with Dr. Hernandez, if you want to start there.
I mean, I think for me, you can't divorce energy, well, especially not from kind of an energy burden, energy insecurity perspective from housing. I mean, people experience, first of all, energy enables housing to be habitable, right? We can't really, there's something about food, you have to be able to preserve food and prepare it. That can't happen outside of the context of energy. You can't actually have a habitable home or a safe home without energy. So just really kind of thinking about the facilitation that happens with energy. But I'll say that initially, when I started to think about this, I was thinking about housing types. And so much of the discussion around clean energy is really geared toward new housing, kind of new construction, the ambitiousness around kind of green housing, which I appreciate, but I think doesn't really kind of get to the real needs around existing housing, the existing housing stock, and the need to kind of retrofit and have better performing housing there. And it was Boston Public Housing that taught me the lesson of the fact that this is not just a matter of affordability, because people that were living in public housing were kind of beneficiaries of a utility allowance, and yet they were still too cold, too hot, extremely uncomfortable, had kind of disconnections of a different sort, not necessarily because of non-payment, but because there was a gas leak that was never addressed, etc. And so to me, the real issue here is about appreciating housing type. Mobile homes, people living in mobile homes around the country, like, do not benefit from energy efficiency. People living, again, in public and subsidized housing, there isn't an energy efficiency standard there. In New York City, actually, public housing is kind of the last on the list when it comes to some of the clean heat transitions, as just an example. You know, so definitely there's a way in which we need to be able to fit our understanding of energy justice into kind of existing or debates around housing, and not necessarily just about the ambitiousness of new shiny housing, but really thinking about what's necessary to improve housing that's existing in the different forms that it takes.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Reames, I want to give you a chance to respond to that as well. I know you may have to duck out early, so I wanted to pass it along.
Yeah, So we call the Department of Energy the Department of Everything. So we have the Weatherization Assistance Program, which is a no-cost energy efficiency retrofit program. Woefully underfunded, but it did get a $2.5 billion boost from the infrastructure law. So studying that program, so that program actually kind of brought me into understanding energy justice, because we had another huge investment in that program during the economic stimulus passed during the recession in 2008, 2009. And, you know, Diana was talking about being in people's homes, right? You know, so I did some qualitative research in Kansas City, and there's a woman that was talking to me about just the connection between just seeing a utility truck. And she, you know, she had participated in an energy conservation program in the 1980s. So first she talked about, you know, people who took out kind of second mortgages on their homes because that's how that program was designed. And she pointed out different houses on her street where the people had been forced out because they couldn't have paid, you know, the second mortgage. But then another thing she said was when she saw a utility truck, her heart rate went up. And I asked her to explain more. And she said, even if they weren't coming to shut me off, they would be shutting off a neighbor, and that had an impact on me. I would run an extension cord, or my bills would go up because now I'm storing more food in my refrigerator, or their kids are coming over at night to, you know, do their homework because they need lights. And so, you know, kind of back to our community conversation, you know, homes are part of a community, right? And so the quality of those homes, you know, as people are living in kind of the persistence of residential segregation, Brad brought up redlining, you know, all of those things, you know, the intersection of those things all center around housing, right? Housing consumption and the ability to move to better housing, or your income not allowing you to repair your current house. And so at the core of this, you know, energy justice is a housing justice issue that I think we just, like Diana said, can't divorce those things. And so, you know, I would love for our federal government to, you know, pass, you know, Congress to pass the Housing as a Right Act, which talks about energy efficiency, which talks about retrofits and repairs and housing affordability. And so, yeah, we have to keep those things integrated.
Well, we're talking about residential energy efficiency, and so I'll pick up on Dr. Reames' invocation of the Weatherization Assistance Program, which is a national program administered by local community action programs in Boston. That's ABCD. So one thing that is just an alphabet soup of coordination challenge for Boston city government is that program serves residents 0 to 60% state median income. And so we have very well-resourced state energy efficiency programs. We spend a lot. We have ratepayer funded. We have other sources of funding. Regional greenhouse gas initiative payments to the Commonwealth are included in efficiency programs. The issue is not really in Massachusetts the amount of resources. When you combine the Weatherization Assistance Program with what we spend on energy efficiency. It's purely program design and implementation. And so, 10 years ago, I pointed out that basic residential weatherization connected more easily with a suburban home with an attic and a basement, owned by a professional, dedicated and capable of being home from work 4 to 5 times that home was touched. And we are just not making sufficient progress on connecting these resources and these utility funded programs, the vendor networks that have developed to implement these programs. We need an enormous amount of human coordination. I tried the first renter initiative in Boston in 2013. I got the utilities to up the amount of the per unit incentive that they were going to pay for a weatherization if a 3-decker was done as a whole building. It was our best way of thinking about how can we get energy efficiency to that renter on the 2nd floor of the triple-decker who has an hourly wage. Well, let's get the whole building retrofitted at once. The amount of coordination that is involved in getting all the residents of even just a 3-unit building to agree to when the work is done, how the work is done, how intrusive the work will be, and just exactly what will happen. I had a full-time, it was actually funded by the utilities. I hired a full-time landlord coordinator to try to sort of bang out these triple-decker whole building retrofits. And it pains me to report that it was just so much coordination. And until there is a social community-based outreach attitude that's at the basis of how utility efficiency program dollars are spent, we're just not going to make progress on having these very well-resourced programs continue to help that single family, attic and basement, professionally owned suburban home.
Thank you. Thank you. Opening up to a couple of questions. So we've had a ton of questions come in Q&A and in the chat. So I want to get to at least a few of them before we wrap up. So one, that rose to the top is there a clear risk for massive climate investments to reinforce racial discrimination of the past? And conversely, to the negative impacts of placing waste sites and polluting power plants, will frontline communities be left behind as infrastructure investments make housing more efficient, healthy, and climate resilient?
May I jump in to say that in the mayor's office, we are laser focused on the community opposition to electric distribution infrastructure. Substations are a huge issue locally. The proposed substation in East Boston was a ballot measure, a non-binding ballot measure that the Attorney General allowed to be on our mayoral election ballot. What I believe city government can do is require state government, which is in complete control of where electricity infrastructure gets built. They have structured state law to allow the utilities to just file for a new substation, and then this wonky sounding board, the Energy Facility Siting Board, can bypass our zoning and just allow the project, and they can pull a building permit and build a substation. And early on, I learned that the utilities would land bank the land that they were going to build a substation on 20 to 40 years in advance, hide their names to do so that we couldn't figure out where and when it was coming. We want those days to be over. I want a major initiative where state government and the utilities come to Boston and explain to our new climate activist mayor, to my climate activist chief, Reverend Mariama White-Hammond, internally, and then to the community. Just why is it that Boston can't shape its own energy future? And in support of that, we're going to be doing work where we can understand the energy uses on the map of Boston and target where distributed energy resources, more photovoltaics, more solar energy, more batteries, more distributed energy resources. If we can target those in areas, you can actually alleviate the sizing of the next round of infrastructure upgrade. And so we're going to work really hard to make sure that it's not environmental justice communities that are the first place the utilities think of building the next substation. And we're going to be working really hard to understanding where we can target these distributed energy resources to help those environmental justice communities avoid as much of the electricity infrastructure as is going to be built, trying to lessen the size of it.
I'll jump in really quickly before I have to say goodbye, but I think Director Swing brings up a great point, right? Investor-owned utilities make their money on the infrastructure that they build. So that is a model that can be in direct conflict with the things that you are trying to do. I think some of the tough conversations we have here is that the infrastructure bill does include things like hydrogen hubs and carbon management and direct carbon capture. Where will these infrastructures be located? And so we have to have the tough conversations about communities that are already bearing the hosting of our energy system, and also understand community opposition to infrastructure that they don't want. And so I think the Justice 40 initiative as a framework allows us to have the discussion about benefits and disbenefits. And so, we have things in there like, consent-based siting and, stakeholder engagement, what's already in communities, how do we add teeth to the NEPA process? And so there's this gap between, what's happening on the local level, what's required by Congress in the infrastructure law that we have to provide funds to build. And I think there needs to be more conversation between the different levels of government on how this will actually be implemented. So we have these clean energy goals, the climate goals, but we have to center justice and equity in the deployment and implementation.
And I just kind of say that there's a lot to be learned about what matters to communities, but I think we don't really start with the right question. We often kind of talk about like, what's the matter? And I learned from a social worker that we really kind of need to be thinking about what matters to communities, right? Like we need to be kind of stepping into these processes with a little bit more of an open mind and not a plan, and an approach around listening, and an approach around appreciating that people not only understand their issues and they understand their lived experience, but that they also kind of can present with their own solutions and their pathways to what would make them feel right. And so when I have done that, what I've learned is that our communities want energy independence. Like they're really thinking about how can they not only support themselves, but be in step with all of the environmental goals that, are packaged in a very sophisticated manner from a policy perspective and from this kind of regulatory perspective. If we distill that, what we learn from communities is that they also want to be, kind of green. They want to be, they want affordable energy. They want to be able to have access to uninterrupted energy service. But that isn't necessarily reflected in a lot of the ways in the process by which policies are designed and introduced to communities. And I think that that's where the mismatch and a lot of times where the resistance comes in. And I think folks are willing to have benefits and disbenefits on both sides, depending on, I'm talking about advantage and privilege, and disadvantage and disprivileges. But that often isn't necessarily considered. So folks that have lots of privilege, they resist all of the things that would actually be of common good. And the folks that don't have power, like in the multiple ways in which that manifests, are often kind of just delivered things without actually being engaged. So there are points of resistance that I think we need to kind of engage differently, in part because we need to be thinking more about listening and appreciating what people need and getting to that, and having the policy process reflect it.
Thank you. And I want to say thanks to Dr. Reames. I know you have to jump off. We really appreciate you joining us. Thanks for joining, and thanks for all the work that you've been doing to forward energy justice. So we had an additional question as well, and I think this one's directed at you, Director Swing. So one question is, what legal actions or protections could be put in place to avoid divestment patterns in electrification in Boston, particularly as BERDO 2.0 is implemented and requires retrofits of large multifamily housing structures.
Well, to explain to the broader audience, BERDO 2.0 is our building emissions reduction ordinance. It requires buildings of a certain size to achieve a carbon performance standard on a declining basis to help the city achieve its carbon neutrality goals by 2050. BERDO 1.0 required buildings of a certain size to just report their annual electricity and water use. And so this is a significant increase in our engagement with the largest buildings in Boston, the largest energy users in Boston, to help us achieve carbon neutrality. I will say that there is built into BERDO 2.0, there are ways to use penalty payments that we will, when the regulations are fully adopted and fully implemented, which is going to be a long process that's underway. But the program design is for penalties that we collect for those who are not in compliance. There will be an equity investment fund with a board that will help us make decisions around that. So that's directly connected to this specific BERDO program. In general, I'll just reiterate that we are integrating energy and infrastructure planning with the basic planning functions of Boston city government. There is a smart utilities program at the Boston Planning and Development Agency. There's a full-time energy and infrastructure planner. That person works very closely with me and the environment team and the climate team. And we really do want to find ways to target the development of new buildings in Boston and the retrofit of major buildings in Boston in a way that address the opportunity to alleviate the sizing of electricity infrastructure that will be needed for electrification.
Thank you. Thank you. We had another question, which I think it touches a bit on something that we addressed earlier around the intersection of energy and housing and transit and other issues. But this particular question asks, what can the different federal agencies or even state agencies, right, be doing to coordinate and work together to address clean energy more broadly across the intersection of those issues?
I think that at the state level, it would be great if there was a breakdown of boundaries between a lot of work on energy efficiency and a lot of work on renewable energy and other sort of alternative energy technologies. For historic reasons, we have this robustly funded energy efficiency program, and it's been frankly way too hard of a push to get this program spending to connect with the other technologies that are necessary for us to achieve our climate future. We have a totally separate renewable energy economic development agency, the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. It's also ratepayer funded. I think that the next governor of Massachusetts should really take a look at the structure of the executive branch of state government and really redesign wholesale, putting communities first, putting issues of economic, energy justice, racial justice first, and figuring out ways in which to serve people instead of having these bucketed collections of resources that end up in an alphabet soup of programs that are very difficult for human beings to access. It really needs a lot of reorganization and rethinking.
I mean, Director Swing, I think you're like absolutely spot on. So I've been thinking a lot about administrative burden. And that's kind of a little bit of an academic concept. And it's really about like just how difficult it is for people to navigate kind of bureaucratic processes. I am working with a local, well, the Mayor's Office of Sustainability here in New York City, and also Kinetic Communities, which is run by Daphne Sanchez. And we have this project to kind of look at what are the barriers to solar adoption for households, for owner occupied homes, 1 to 4 family? And not surprisingly, the real issue is, yes, I mean, affordability and who has the luxury to kind of spend, all this money, and the return on investment isn't necessarily clear when it comes to rooftop solar. But the other bigger problem is that people don't know how to get through all of the hurdles, the applications. And I mean, I think it's to Director Swing's point, having all the visits and folks coming in, and how many papers, how many applications do you have to fill out? And so we are, again, because these issues are designed at this other level, they're uncoordinated at the city level, they're uncoordinated at the state level, they're uncoordinated at the federal level. It makes it that much more difficult for the intended user. And when the intended user has other things that are drawing on their attention and their bandwidth, it makes it that much more difficult to actually appreciate, or, like kind of the availability of resources. I don't know that I drove the points that I want to make around the Department of Energy and Environment, because one of the things that they've done, and this is in DC, is that they've actually streamlined the process. So if you have someone who is kind of qualified for LIHEAP, they actually kind of pull them through the whole process. So they say, well, you also get the utility discount program, and you're also enrolled in our community solar program, and you're also enrolled. And so what you end up having in that kind of approach are folks that have multiple, they're enrolled in multiple programs. You increase the resources to the household. You make it that much easier for them to actually benefit from this. And you make it so that they actually have kind of less of a, not just administrative burden, but all of the other burdens that they might experience: food, housing, energy, etc. And I think that that's kind of what we need. We need this more streamlined approach. We need opportunities for there to, kind of for us to be thinking a lot more from the user experience perspective, and not necessarily from the kind of bureaucratic perspective that makes it that much more difficult. And also, there's another piece to this, which is about penalties. I think from a policy perspective, there's a lot of ambition about what ought to be. But what happens when there's a kind of a lack of compliance for all of the different reasons that we described, right? I mean, one is that the kind of policies are ever evolving, and it's kind of hard to keep up with this. If you're even a building owner of something, I mean, a 3-family home, I mean, that's kind of, a whole different example, but definitely even building owners that kind of house low-income households, low and moderate income householders, they have their own kind of challenges in meeting all of the new requirements. In New York City, I actually own a 3-family, 4-family home in New York City. There's new bud bug regulations, there's new lead regulations, the Department of Energy and the water, the DEP is consistently coming up with their own new policies. By the time I'm done with this, and I would actually say I'm pretty capable, I'm like exhausted and non-compliant, right? And not that I want to be, but basically that's kind of like what ends up happening. So I think we need to be thinking a lot more about streamlining, but also making the penalties different. It shouldn't be like additional fines and fees and kind of more challenges in the violation process. It actually should be more resources. How do we get people to kind of be compliant? And that's kind of a whole hodgepodge of different ideas there. But essentially, I think what we need to be doing is making things easier. But I think because so many people are coming at these interests around clean energy, retrofitting, making things more efficient, it actually ends up feeling bigger and harder for folks that want to participate, but don't necessarily know how to insert themselves and don't have the proper supports and resources to do so.
Thank you. And this came up about a year or so ago, and Dr. Hernandez, you kind of mentioned like the bubbling up of now these kind of water assistance and affordability programs that didn't exist before. And ARPA funds came out and we're now allowed to go for water assistance. And like the biggest barrier to that I've seen has been this idea that I already qualify for LIHEAP. Now I got to go back. I may already qualify for food assistance. Now I have to go back and do this whole other application and process again in order to now qualify for this other, this water assistance that's fairly new. So the idea of being able to streamline this kind of work in a way that gives people more ease of access to the resources that they need when we can look and see that, everything else says that they need them instead of making it more difficult. And I think that coordination amongst, agencies at the federal and state and local level is essential to making sure that resources go to the folks who need it most and it gets there in a timely manner. We have an additional question as well, which I think is pretty interesting. It kind of gets into this, kind of who has the final say on energy, policies. Do they lean more in the direction of a legislature or administrative body? And I know, there was a mention of the public utility commissions. And then I'll tack on to that as well, a separate question. But, could these regulatory boards require the production of utility data, which goes back to kind of the conversation we had earlier. So kind of a two-part, right? Kind of where does, who has the most power in the final decisions from a political standpoint, right? And is there a way to require the production of information?
So the Department of Public Utilities should serve the public. So there's like the part of me that wakes up and goes to work and wants to make a difference that says the public should be the, the first and foremost, the front, the end, the beginning and the end. But the truth is state government defines how the distribution of electricity happens. And it defines the franchise territories, so-called, of your electric company. So there's, boundaries of which company serves what areas. And if the Department of Public Utilities wanted to order the utilities to share more data, they could do so. I need to say that there are genuine individual customer privacy issues with the production of individual customer utility data. There are important equity reasons for certain individuals that require machinery for medical uses that may just not want to share that they're constantly on a ventilator or whatever. That just must be put out there. But as a general matter, yes, I think for the distribution of electricity, it is the state government that calls the shots. And if they wanted to, they could figure out ways to have more useful data shared with local governments, with community groups, to help community groups target door-to-door outreach to say your energy use intensity is just through the roof. And if you participated in this efficiency program, and by the way, we have some people here that will literally hold your hand through it because it's complicated and you may need translation. And, we really want you to retrofit your home. That begins and ends with a specific understanding of the energy use intensity of that particular residence. And so, yes, I do wish state government would figure out ways to both respect individual privacy, but share information in useful ways to the right organizations that would use it respectfully.
Dr. Hernandez, did you want to?
No, I'll just say that I appreciate how Director Swing kind of started this with, which is, who should have the power versus who does. And I think, we absolutely need more people power in this. And I think the use of information and the availability of it can help in kind of better decision making. We need data-driven policies. That's impossible to do while the utility companies have, they can make a case for themselves about like rate redesign, for instance, and they do so in really sophisticated manners. People on the ground don't quite kind of participate in the same ways and don't get their kind of angle hurt as much. But from a planning perspective and from the perspective of being able to design policies and or kind of design program interventions and target appropriately, we need the data. But they can't, on the one hand, have the kind of public cover or the cover of the duty to serve and, you know, like operating with the public in mind, and at the same time having all of the protections that come with being a private corporation and private entity. I think that you know, there has to be some give and take, and I think you know, there's more to be said about who should have power, and I think people should have more power in this process.
Thank you. We have a question of what law, if you could, would you pass right now to aid in energy justice and or aid communities, particularly disadvantaged communities or otherwise? So it sounds like what's, you know, kind of, you know, if you could think of a single mechanism right now that would make a significant difference, what would that be?
I mean, for me, it would be kind of rate redesign. I think we don't have rates that accommodate affordability. The rates across the board tend to be equal, but the burdens are unequal. And so to me, you know, it's kind of aligned with the percent income payment plan. That's not necessarily enough, but to me, that's kind of a really easy lift. I'd also like to see the transfer of energy in kind. And by that, I mean, you know, solar really offers a different kind of opportunity. And, you know, being able to not just have a bill offset, but really actually provide kilowatts to households. We haven't been thinking about it that way, but I think a lot about food pantries and how if someone is in need, they can actually get food in kind. And really, there's kind of an interesting opportunity to be able to think about this from an energy perspective. And there's a little bit of like kind of figuring it out that needs to happen, but I'd like to be able to see a day when, you know, folks that need kilowatts are given kilowatts, not necessarily that it continues to be a bill assistance mechanism of energy assistance that we provide.
So if I had to focus on one law, it would be at the state law level. It would involve the organization of state government to connect policy and program development personnel with the current regulation of investor-owned utilities far more. We need much more integrated understanding of how rate design, as Dr. Hernandez rightly cited as a target area, how rate design, and then what we do when we collect those rates. And as I've indicated, in Massachusetts, we have very resourced ratepayer funded efficiency programs. And, you know, there's just such a bottleneck at the state regulatory level to get solar installations through interconnection processes. It's just too difficult. It's just not public facing, public serving work. It's just work that's at the, you know, to help the utilities deal with its workflow, instead of the utilities being pushed to figure out how to serve the public and its needs. And I would say similarly, we have had a legal motion for reconsideration to ask the State Department of Public Utilities to reconsider its refusal to provide us with those addresses that I mentioned at the beginning of the hour. We just want the addresses of our own residents in Boston who are electricity customers, so that we can reach out to them to help them with this predatory supply issue, which I'm telling you is, when you see the amounts that these people are paying 3 times the amounts, it's absolutely wrong. And, you know, if it is a matter of personnel, I don't believe it is. I believe that we need to have They don't even, the Department of Public Utilities does not even have a requirement to ever answer our motion to have their decision reconsidered. They can just ignore it forever. We would like a law change, it's as wonky as can be, to just say, deal with it in 90 days, one way or the other, just tell us. Because once they deal with it, then we can get out of the administrative agency side of things and go to court. So again, this is a law institute. And so we're talking about the boundaries of administrative processes and judicial processes. And as law students know, you have to exhaust your administrative remedies before you can go to court. And our current system allows the administrative agency to just make it impossible for you to ever exhaust your remedies and get to court. And so those are very wonky changes, but I see that as a necessary starting place.
Thank you. And then I want to ask maybe one or two more questions before I give you all some time for kind of closing thoughts. But and this one will be for both of you. So how does Director Swing, in your instance, how does Boston help residents particularly use cleaner energy and access cleaner energy, and what considerations of equity shape your approach? And then Diana, similarly as well, just what are you seeing cities around the country do to help residents actually access clean energy?
So we're deploying community-based solar programs under the Solarize model, where you identify a vendor, and the more residents who sign up for solar in a specific area, the better the price. It's a model that has been tried in many jurisdictions. It's familiar in Massachusetts. So that's one specific way we're trying to get renewable energy directly connected to our residents. And we're hoping to target communities, environmental justice communities first in this effort, because we believe that that's where the greatest help can connect. I would just say that municipal aggregation, this electricity buying program, that is indeed citywide. It's opt-out, but we have now over 200,000 Boston Electric customers that we serve by buying electricity with them. And the whole point of the program is to have a better renewable energy content than is required under state law. So the renewable portfolio standard is around 20% renewables in Massachusetts. And so we provide 10% more than that. And we use our pricing power to get there. And we also offer a 100% green product. Right now, because the utilities procured their 6-month block of electricity at a bad moment for their own pricing, we're able to offer 100% green electricity at a better price than you would get if you just stayed with your electric utilities basic service. And once again, I'm legally required to say that we cannot promise that our electricity rates will always be lower than the utilities rates.
I think that there's been kind of an emphasis on community solar. That has been kind of the main avenue, and it's helpful in some ways because it allows for more people to participate, including renters, that would otherwise kind of not be available, wouldn't be kind of able to access clean energy otherwise. So community solar to me has been kind of the primary pathway by which inclusion has occurred. What I guess what I would like to see is a little bit different. What I would like to see is that that basically tenants, and I'll tell you, when in New York City, for instance, we did a study about clean heat transitions, and buildings that are burning the dirtiest fuels happen to be in the lowest income neighborhoods, communities of color, etc. And when we kind of asked people about this, they were supportive generally of like kind of transitioning to clean energy, but they also kind of were met with a lot of risk. So the buildings that transitioned to kind of the cleanest fuels and also incorporated energy efficiency, etc., ran the risk of pushing those tenants out. And so as we think about how to ensure that people are able to access clean energy, really thinking about this from a rental perspective especially. We also have to make sure that that's coupled with protections, so that those folks that are the intended beneficiaries remain the beneficiaries indeed. Otherwise, it means that the buildings themselves get improved, but then they fall right into this whole issue around the push factors that are already very present with gentrification, for instance. And so as I kind of see it, it's not just about making clean energy available. It's also coupling that with the protections so that folks that are most vulnerable can actually benefit and stay. That's an issue that I think hasn't been paid enough attention.
Thank you. So before we wrap up, I want to give each of you, a minute or so to kind of give some closing thoughts for the audience. Anything particular you want to share as we close out before I hand it back over to Cindy.
I just want to kind of say that Director Swing has mentioned a lot this kind of issue of predatory energy, and I want to say that runs the risk really of not just creating higher energy burdens and higher costs and other things, but we really lack trust. And I think communities of color and low-income communities absolutely have so many different pathways to not trust and to not understand kind of the energy landscape. And we really need to target the things that are making it more difficult for them to be supportive of clean energy pathways, because it's those very experiences, those negative experiences with kind of the predatory providers that make it almost impossible for us, like those of us that are really thinking about more positive pathways to bring folks along. So I think that's, to me, an absolutely appropriate approach, is that we have to really get to like those bad actors so that folks can start to understand and learn and trust what's coming forward when we think about clean energy.
I work for municipal government. We pick up the trash, we put out fires, we police the streets, we educate kids, we deal with public health emergencies, we plow the snow, we provide basic city services. That is an intimate relationship with the community we serve. After 27 years in the mayor's office, I know every street in the city of Boston. I love it with all my heart. It is an incredible privilege to serve a city. My life's work has been to have Boston give shape and direction to its energy future, instead of having these energy powers at the state, regional, and federal level happen to the city. It started with energy efficiency and getting that much more targeted return on what we pay in with renewal, with our ratepayer funded efficiency programs. It's now really moving towards where we can demand of the state government and the utilities that serve us, that they explain to us how can we give shape and direction to very targeted location-based energy improvements that serve the needs of our communities of color, that serve the needs of low-income communities, that serve the environmental justice communities first and foremost, that serve Boston in a better way. And we have to do that in a way that keeps us on track to reduce our carbon emissions to net zero by 2050, or else our climate crisis will take over all these issues and make life itself impossible.
Thank you to Dr. Hernandez, Director Swing, and Dr. Tony Reames for joining us today. The conversations around energy justice are so important, as Dr. Reames mentioned, right? Certain communities being canaries in the coal mine, right? Centering racial justice in these conversations is so critical. So thank you all for joining us. Now I'll turn it over to Cindy.
Yeah, and just to echo Jeremy, because I know we're right on the dot. I mean, just thank you so much for navigating us through such nuance and complexity. Of course, there's never enough time for us to really fully unpack all this. But I think what, the Rappaport Center represent is how important it is for government to be at the forefront, to be in touch with our communities, because without these particular understanding, we won't be able to make really good informative laws or policy. So thank you so much. And thank you to the audience and for all the wonderful questions. So on behalf of the Rappaport Center, it was a true pleasure. So thank you. Bye, everyone.